During our family vacation, the kind with shared dinners and forced smiles, my husband cleared his throat and said it like he was ordering dessert. "I found someone new. I'm done pretending." The room went silent. Even the kids froze mid-bite. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I smiled, too calm to be normal, and reached into my bag. Slowly, I slid a thin envelope across the table and said, "Then this is yours." He laughed at first. Then he read the first page. His smile vanished. His hand started shaking. And for a moment, I thought he might actually fall off his chair. From the outside, our marriage looked like something people quietly envied. 15 years together, 2 healthy kids, a comfortable home, and the kind of routines that made life feel stable. We hosted holidays. We took annual vacations. Friends used us as an example when they talked about commitment, about making it work. I believed that image, too. I wore it like armor, convincing myself that consistency meant happiness, that calm meant love. My husband was dependable in all the visible ways. He showed up to work events, posed for photos, kissed my cheek in public. He never raised his voice. Never missed a birthday. When people asked how we were doing, he'd squeeze my hand and say, "Better than ever." I smiled because that's what wives like me did. I told myself love didn't have to be loud. It could be quiet. Predictable. Safe. At home, life ran on schedules and habits. Mornings were coffee and silence. Evenings were homework, dinner, television humming in the background. We talked about logistics more than feelings, who was picking up the kids, what bills were due, where we'd go next summer. I didn't question it. This was adulthood, I thought. Passion fades. Responsibility replaces it. That's what maturity looks like. Looking back, the emptiness hid in plain sight. The way conversations ended quickly. The way laughter felt forced. The way his touch lingered a second too short. I noticed it, but I explained it away. Stress. Work. Life. Everyone goes through phases. I told myself not to be dramatic, not to want more than what I already had. I thought loyalty was measured by time. By endurance. By staying. I believed that because we had built a life together, it couldn't simply disappear. I trusted the years. I trusted the image. I trusted him. And that trust, quietly and patiently, was already being used against me. The signs didn't arrive all at once. They slipped in slowly, disguised as inconvenience, as stress, as things I told myself weren't worth arguing over. A late night at work here. A phone call taken in another room there. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point to and say, "This is it." Just small changes that felt wrong in my chest but harmless in my head. He started guarding his phone like it was an extension of his body. The screen always faced down. Notifications muted. If I asked who was calling, he'd answer quickly, too quickly, and change the subject. When I laughed it off, he relaxed. When I didn't, he sighed and said I was reading into things. I wanted to believe him. I told myself privacy wasn't secrecy. Couples were allowed to have space. There were nights he came home distracted, eyes somewhere else even when he was sitting right beside me. I'd talk about my day and watch him nod, his attention drifting like I wasn't really there. When I asked if something was wrong, he'd smile and say, "Just tired." That word became his shield. Tired explained everything. It ended conversations before they could start. Once, I found a receipt in his jacket from a restaurant we never went to. When I asked about it, he laughed and said it was a work lunch I'd forgotten. I hadn't forgotten. I remembered clearly. But I also remembered every time I'd been accused of overthinking, of being too sensitive. So I swallowed the doubt and apologized instead. Each red flag came with an explanation, and I accepted every one. Not because I was stupid, but because I was invested. I had built a life on believing in us. Admitting something was wrong meant risking everything I'd worked to hold together. So I chose comfort over clarity. I didn't realize then that ignoring your instincts doesn't make them disappear. It just teaches them to wait. That vacation wasn't just a getaway. In my mind, it was a reset button. We had planned it months in advance, choosing a place that felt special enough to matter. A beach resort, shared rooms, long dinners together. No work distractions. No excuses. I told myself that if we could just step out of our routine, we'd find our way back to each other. I needed this trip more than I admitted. The distance between us had been growing quietly, and I was tired of pretending it didn't scare me. I believed time alone, surrounded by family, would remind him of what we had built. Of the kids. Of the history. Of me. Vacations had always been our safe space, the place where smiles came easier and arguments softened. The kids were excited in the way only children can be, counting days on the calendar, talking about the pool and the food and sleeping late. Watching them made me hopeful. I wanted them to see us happy together, laughing at the same table, the way families are supposed to. I thought if they felt secure, maybe I would too. Our relatives came with us, which made the trip feel important, almost ceremonial. Shared breakfasts. Group photos. Inside jokes. I saw it as a reminder that we weren't just a couple, we were part of something bigger. A family that had witnessed our marriage from the beginning. I believed that mattered to him. I didn't know then that he saw the vacation differently. To me, it was a chance to heal. To him, it was a stage. A controlled setting where he could end things cleanly, surrounded by witnesses, convinced he was being honest and brave. I arrived hoping to save my marriage. He arrived already planning its funeral. The medical test wasn't something I planned. It wasn't driven by fear or suspicion or any dramatic instinct. It started as a routine appointment, the kind you schedule between errands, expecting nothing more than a quick in and out and a polite smile from the nurse. I felt fine. Healthy. Normal. There was no reason to think anything in my body was quietly changing. During the visit, my doctor asked a few standard questions, then paused, scrolling through my chart longer than usual. She suggested running an additional test, almost casually, like it was a formality. Just to be thorough, she said. I agreed without thinking twice. I trusted her. Doctors didn't recommend things without reason, and I had nothing to hide. The results didn't come back right away. Days passed. Life continued. I packed for the trip, helped the kids with schoolwork, cooked dinner, folded laundry. The test slipped to the back of my mind, buried under normal responsibilities. If something had been wrong, I assumed someone would have called by now. When the call finally came, it wasn't rushed, but it wasn't casual either. My doctor asked if I was sitting down. That alone made my stomach tighten. Her voice stayed calm, professional, but there was a weight behind it that I couldn't ignore. She explained that the results showed something unexpected. Something that required a conversation, not an email. As she spoke, I felt a strange detachment, like she was talking about someone else. She asked questions that didn't make sense to me at first. Careful questions. Specific ones. About my marriage. About my husband. About timelines. I answered automatically, my mind struggling to catch up with the direction the conversation was going. By the time the call ended, my hands were cold and my heart was racing. I hadn't received a diagnosis yet, not fully. Just information. Enough to unsettle me. Enough to plant a thought I wasn't ready to face. I sat there in silence, staring at the wall, unaware that this accidental test had already changed everything that I read the medical report the way people read things they're afraid to understand. Slowly, then faster, then again from the beginning. The words were clinical, detached, stripped of emotion. Numbers. Terms. Probabilities. But beneath the language was a message so loud it felt like it was pressing against my chest. It wasn't a diagnosis that explained pain or fatigue. It wasn't something inherited or random. It was something that came with conditions. With timelines. With very specific circumstances that couldn't be misinterpreted once you understood them. I didn't at first. I wanted to misunderstand it. I wanted to believe there was another explanation hiding somewhere in the margins. The report included notes from my doctor, careful and deliberate. Phrases like, inconsistent with patient history, and, requires partner disclosure. My eyes kept returning to those lines. Inconsistent. Disclosure. Words that didn't belong in my life, not in my marriage. I had been faithful. I knew my own body. I knew my past. Which meant the inconsistency wasn't coming from me. What unsettled me most was how calm the document was. No accusations. No drama. Just facts laid out cleanly, patiently, waiting to be acknowledged. It didn't rush me. It didn't comfort me either. It simply existed, undeniable and quiet, like a truth that didn't care whether I was ready. I thought about the questions my doctor had asked. The way she paused before each one. The way she listened more than she spoke. At the time, I thought she was being cautious. Now I understood she was being kind. She already knew where the conversation was heading. She was giving me time to catch up. I folded the report and placed it back into the envelope. My hands were steady, even though my thoughts weren't. I hadn't confronted anyone. I hadn't said a word. But something fundamental had shifted. The marriage I believed in no longer matched the evidence in my hands. And in that moment, I realized the report wasn't just medical. It was proof. The realization didn't come with tears or shouting. It arrived quietly, settling into me with a weight that felt final. I sat alone at the kitchen table, the envelope resting in front of me, and replayed the last few months in my head. Conversations. Absences. Excuses. All the moments I had dismissed now lined up with unsettling clarity. I opened my calendar and started counting backward. Dates I remembered clearly. Nights he came home late. Weekends he claimed to be working. Trips he said were mandatory. The timeline formed without effort, like it had been waiting for me to look. What the report suggested fit too perfectly into those gaps. There was no room left for coincidence. What hurt most wasn't just the betrayal itself, but the precision of it. He hadn't been reckless. He'd been careful. Calculated. He had protected himself while slowly letting me doubt my own instincts. Every time I questioned something, he had met me with patience and reassurance, making me feel irrational for even wondering. I thought about the way he'd touch my shoulder and say, "You worry too much." About how often I'd apologized for asking questions I had every right to ask. The report didn't just expose what he'd done. It exposed how thoroughly I'd been manipulated into silence. I didn't need him to confess. I didn't need proof beyond what I already had. The truth was sitting there, undeniable and calm, asking nothing from me except acknowledgement. In that moment, something in me went still. The part that hoped I was wrong finally gave up. Strangely, the pain came with clarity. I wasn't imagining things. I hadn't failed as a wife. I hadn't been distant or demanding or unreasonable. I had been loyal. Honest. Present. The betrayal wasn't mutual. It was deliberate, and it wasn't mine to carry. I folded the calendar shut and pushed the envelope aside. I wasn't ready to confront him yet, but I was ready to stop protecting him. That was the moment I knew our marriage, as I understood it, was already over. Even if he hadn't said the words yet, every instinct told me to confront him right then. To demand explanations. To throw the report on the table and watch him scramble for words. But instincts born from pain don't always lead to strength. I knew that if I spoke too soon, I'd lose something important: control. I had learned, over the years, how he handled confrontation. He deflected. He minimized. He turned conversations into debates about tone instead of truth. If I accused him without preparation, he would make it about my emotions, my reactions, my timing. I refused to let the truth get buried under his ability to talk his way out of responsibility. There were also the children to consider. They were observant, sensitive, already picking up on the tension between us. I wasn't going to turn their vacation into a battlefield without understanding exactly how and when the truth would surface. They deserved stability, not chaos fueled by my anger. So I waited. I gathered myself. I reread the report until the shock faded and only certainty remained. I listened more than I spoke. I watched how easily he lied, how naturally he slipped into the role of the devoted husband in front of others. Each moment of patience gave me clarity instead of doubt. Waiting wasn't weakness. It was preparation. It gave me time to decide how this would end, not in a rush of emotion, but in a way that left no room for denial. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning exposure. The kind that doesn't require shouting, because the truth speaks loudly enough on its own. By the time we left for the family vacation, I wasn't carrying hope anymore. I was carrying evidence. And I knew that when he finally chose to speak, I would be ready to listen, silently, before handing him the one thing he never expected me to have. Dinner that night felt rehearsed, even before a word was spoken. The table was crowded with plates and half-filled glasses, the low hum of ocean air drifting in from the open windows. Laughter moved around me, but it didn't quite reach me. My husband was unusually relaxed, leaning back in his chair, smiling more than he had all week. I noticed it. I said nothing. Halfway through the meal, he cleared his throat. Not loudly. Just enough to pull attention toward him. Conversations faded one by one until the only sound left was silverware settling against porcelain. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He looked at the table, at the people gathered around it, as if he were addressing a room instead of a wife. "I don't want to lie anymore," he said calmly. "I've met someone else." The words landed softly, but the impact was violent. A fork clattered to the floor. Someone gasped. I felt the air leave my lungs, even though I had been expecting this moment. Hearing it out loud was different. Permanent. He continued, explaining himself with practiced ease. How he'd been unhappy for a long time. How this wasn't planned. How he deserved to be honest. Each sentence was carefully shaped to sound reasonable, even noble. He framed it as courage, as growth. As if betrayal were simply another step in self-discovery. I looked around the table. Faces frozen. Eyes darting between us. The kids stared at their plates, not fully understanding, but sensing the shift. No one interrupted him. No one challenged him. The silence gave him permission to keep going. Finally, he turned toward me. There was relief in his expression, like a burden had been lifted. "I hope you can understand," he said, lowering his voice. "I didn't want to hurt you." That was the moment I realized how confident he was. Confident that I would cry. Argue. Beg. Or quietly accept it, the way I always had. He believed this was his ending to control. I felt something steady settle inside me. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't rise. I simply reached for my bag beneath the table, already knowing what came next. Because while he thought he was finally telling the truth, he had no idea I was about to do the same. That I didn't respond right away. I let the silence stretch just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Long enough for him to shift in his chair and glance around, as if waiting for support that didn't come. Then, without a word, I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope. Plain. Unmarked. Thinner than anyone expected it to be. I placed it on the table between us and slowly slid it across the polished surface. The sound was soft, almost polite, but it cut through the room more sharply than any accusation could have. Every eye followed it as it stopped in front of him. He looked at it, confused, then up at me, searching my face for clues. "What's this?" he asked, forcing a laugh. There was still confidence in his voice, still that assumption that whatever I was about to do couldn't possibly rival what he'd just confessed. I met his eyes and smiled. Not the kind of smile meant to comfort or reassure, but one that came from certainty. "Read it," I said quietly. Just 2 words. No explanation. No emotion. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The envelope spoke for itself. He hesitated, fingers resting on the edge, as if touching it might somehow change what was inside. Around us, the table had gone completely still. No one reached for their glasses. No one spoke. Even the kids sensed something had shifted, something heavier than anger settling into the room. This wasn't an argument. It was a reveal. He finally picked up the envelope and opened it. The paper slid out easily, too easily, like it had been waiting for this moment. I watched his eyes drop to the first page, watched the casual curiosity drain from his face. The confidence he carried just moments earlier cracked, then vanished entirely. And before he could finish reading, I already knew, the conversation had just changed direction, and he was no longer the one in control. At first, he didn't react at all. His eyes moved across the page slowly, as if he were reading something ordinary, something he could dismiss with a joke or a shrug. Then his brow furrowed. He leaned closer, rereading the same lines, his lips parting slightly as the meaning began to sink in. The change was physical. The color drained from his face so quickly it was impossible to miss. His shoulders stiffened, and his grip on the paper tightened until the edges bent under his fingers. He swallowed hard, glancing up at me for a split second before looking back down, like he hoped the words might rearrange themselves if he checked again. "What is this?" he asked, though his voice lacked conviction. It wasn't a challenge. It was a reflex, the sound someone makes when they already know the answer but aren't ready to say it out loud. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as everyone watched his composure unravel in real time. He flipped to the next page too fast, scanning instead of reading now. His knee bounced under the table. A bead of sweat formed near his temple. The man who had just announced his affair with calm certainty now looked trapped, cornered by ink and paper. Someone across the table whispered my name. Another person shifted uncomfortably. The kid stared at him, confusion giving way to fear. He noticed then. He straightened abruptly, forcing a breath, trying to recover the authority he'd had minutes earlier. "This doesn't make sense," he said, louder now, as if volume could undo facts. He laughed once, sharp and hollow. "There has to be a mistake." But his hands were shaking. The paper trembled visibly, betraying him even as he tried to regain control. I didn't interrupt. I didn't explain. I let the document do what it was designed to do, tell the truth without emotion. Every second of silence pressed the reality deeper into him. He wasn't shocked because he didn't understand. He was shocked because he did. The first page wasn't dramatic. No bold warnings. No emotional language. Just clinical findings, neatly organized, the way truth often is when it doesn't need permission to exist. It stated that I had tested positive for a condition that doesn't appear on its own. It doesn't come from stress. It doesn't come from bad luck. It comes from exposure. Recent exposure. The report went further, outlining timelines with unsettling precision. How long it takes to appear. How long it stays undetected. How the window aligned perfectly with the months my husband had been distant, distracted, unavailable. The document didn't accuse him by name, but it didn't need to. There was only one possible source. He stopped reading and looked up at me again, this time with fear fully visible in his eyes. "You gave this to me?" he whispered, as if volume might lessen the damage. I nodded once. That was all. The room held its breath. The second page explained something else, something he hadn't considered. The condition wasn't just proof of infidelity. It was proof of duration. Of repetition. Not a single mistake. Not a moment of weakness. It meant this hadn't been recent, hadn't been impulsive. It had been ongoing. Planned. Sustained. A quiet murmur moved around the table as someone closer leaned in, catching fragments of text. Words like chronic and extended exposure don't leave much room for interpretation. The story he'd just told, that this was new, unexpected, something that simply happened, collapsed under the weight of medical fact. My voice was steady when I finally spoke. The doctor asked me questions, I said calmly. Questions I could answer honestly. I paused, letting that land. Your timeline doesn't match the report. His mouth opened, then closed. He searched for words, excuses, anything to regain ground. But this wasn't an argument anymore. There was no opinion to debate. No narrative to reshape. The report existed independently of both of us. I explained only what was necessary. That the test had been routine. That the results were accidental. That I hadn't gone looking for proof. Proof had found me. I watched as realization settled fully into him, not just that he'd been caught, but that he'd underestimated me. The final page outlined next steps. Treatment. Disclosure. Accountability. It wasn't written for him, but it implicated him completely. The responsibility it described didn't belong to the person who received the diagnosis. It belonged to the person who caused it. By the time I finished, the table was silent again. Not shocked silence this time, but understanding. The kind that can't be undone. He stared at the pages like they might burn him if he held them too long. That medical report didn't just reveal his affair. It revealed the truth he thought he could control. And in that moment, everyone at the table knew exactly who had been lying, and who hadn't. The panic hit him in waves. First, denial. He shook his head, pushing the papers away like distance alone could erase what they contained. This is being misunderstood, he said quickly. Medical things aren't always clear. Tests can be wrong. His voice rose with each sentence, urgency replacing confidence. When that didn't work, he shifted. He reached for me, palm open, eyes pleading now. We can talk about this privately, he whispered, glancing around the table. This doesn't need to happen here. The request wasn't about my feelings. It was about control. About minimizing the damage while there was still an audience. I stayed seated. Calm. Silent. I didn't need to respond to every lie he offered. The more he spoke, the more fractured his story became. Dates changed. Explanations contradicted each other. The careful narrative he'd prepared unraveled under the simplest questions from the people around us. Someone asked how long it had been going on. He hesitated too long before answering. Someone else asked if the other woman knew about us. He looked at me instead of responding. Each pause revealed more than words ever could. His voice cracked when he finally admitted pieces of the truth, though even then he tried to soften them. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he said. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. The irony hung heavy in the air. Meaning doesn't erase impact. Intention doesn't undo harm. The children were ushered away from the table, guided gently by relatives who now understood more than they wanted to. Watching them leave broke something in him. His shoulders slumped. The fight drained out of him all at once. He sat back, staring at the table, exposed and smaller than I had ever seen him. The man who walked into dinner convinced he was ending our marriage on his terms was gone. In his place was someone facing consequences he never anticipated. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. The collapse wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet. Complete. And it marked the exact moment he realized he wasn't losing me because he found someone else, he was losing me because he told the truth too late. The rest of the evening unfolded without ceremony. No shouting. No dramatic exit. Just a quiet dispersal, like a storm that had already passed and left everyone standing in the wreckage. Conversations were hushed. Eyes avoided his. The relatives who had once laughed easily with him now moved around him carefully, as if proximity alone carried risk. He tried to speak to me again later, away from the table. His voice was softer, stripped of confidence. He talked about counseling. About mistakes. About how complicated things had become. I listened without interrupting, not because I was considering his words, but because I wanted to remember how little they moved me. The attachment I once felt had already detached. That night, he didn't sleep in our room. It wasn't a decision we discussed. It simply happened. A bag was packed quietly. Doors opened and closed without argument. The children slept, unaware of how permanently the ground beneath our family had shifted. I watched the hallway light turn off and felt a strange calm settle over me. In the days that followed, consequences arrived one by one. The other woman disappeared from his story almost immediately. Whatever fantasy he'd built around her didn't survive exposure. Secrets rarely do. Friends stopped calling. Family members asked questions he couldn't answer without admitting what he'd done. The narrative he'd hoped to control slipped out of his hands. People knew the truth, not the version he rehearsed, but the one supported by evidence and silence. Sympathy thinned. Respect vanished. He wasn't the man who bravely chose honesty anymore. He was the man who lied until the truth cornered him. Legal conversations replaced emotional ones. Practical steps followed inevitable outcomes. The marriage didn't end in chaos. It ended in clarity. And clarity, I learned, is far more powerful than anger. What he lost that night wasn't just a wife. It was the image he relied on. The benefit of doubt. The belief that he could rewrite reality to suit himself. Those things don't return once they're gone. As for me, I didn't feel broken. I felt lighter. The truth had done what years of effort couldn't. It had freed me from the responsibility of holding something together that was already falling apart. In the months that followed, life didn't suddenly become easy, but it became honest. I rebuilt my days slowly, without rushing to fill the quiet. Mornings felt different without tension waiting for me in the next room. I learned how much energy I'd been spending trying to preserve an illusion that no longer deserved protection. Healing didn't come from revenge or vindication. It came from understanding that silence can be a form of strength. I didn't need to explain myself to everyone. The truth had already spoken, clearly and without emotion. People who mattered understood. Those who didn't were never really listening anyway. I stopped questioning my instincts. The voice I'd once ignored became something I trusted again. I learned that patience doesn't mean endurance, and loyalty doesn't require self-erasure. Love should never demand blindness. It should feel safe, not confusing. What surprised me most was how calm I felt looking back. The moment I handed him that envelope wasn't about punishment. It was about reclaiming my agency. I didn't raise my voice because I didn't need to. The truth doesn't need volume. It only needs space. If you're watching this and you've ever felt that quiet doubt in your chest, the one you keep dismissing because you're afraid of what it might mean, listen to it. Pay attention. Protect yourself. You don't have to act immediately. You just have to stop lying to yourself. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to confront someone in anger. It's to wait, to prepare, and to let the truth meet them where they feel safest. Because when it does, it changes everything. If this story resonated with you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And remember, your silence might just be the strongest thing you're holding.